Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome to Emancipations. Today we are here to talk about a social history of analytic philosophy by the philosopher based in London by the name of Christoph Schuringa. Welcome to the program. Christoph, how are you today?
Thanks so much, Daniel. Great to be here. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm well. I'm it's summertime. I'm energized. I'm excited to talk about analytic philosophy and why analytic philosophy is an apolitical philosophy, and really whether analytic philosophy, how we might actually come to specify and define it. And so there's a lot to discuss in your book. The subtitle is How Politics Has Shaped an Apolitical Philosophy. Okay, so, immediately I am struck by the newness of analytic philosophy in the sense that it emerges also out of, in large part, I guess you could say, what's called Red Vienna, maybe before that. And Red Vienna is something that we've talked about a lot on my show because it was a milieu in which you had Bolshevik ideas. You had Freud, you had the cafes where Trotsky was coming to visit, and it was probably one of the most intellectually fecund and stimulating places to be in Europe in about the 1920s and before, largely a result of massive social democratic welfare after World War I. But your story really does begin before that, actually. Let me just say, by way of introduction, that Christoph studied philosophy at King's College, at Cambridge, and at Birkbeck in London. And you are originally from the UK, is that right?
Originally from the Netherlands, but that's
originally from the Netherlands. Okay, but you've done most of your studies in the UK.
That's right. Yeah.
So Christoph is a Hegelian. He is the editor of the Hegel Bulletin. He's currently a professor at Northeastern University in London. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
And his work has appeared in Jacobin, New Left Review, European Journal of Philosophy, and elsewhere. And so I suppose, the first question would be, given that your book has this beautifully polemical style and method, which we'll learn about, and given that you write about Marxism and Hegelianism, and given that analytic philosophy prides themselves as having something to say about Hegel and Marx, there are analytic Marxists, as we saw with my last show with Ben Burgess. There's also analytic Hegelians, there's analytic Nietzscheans, there's analytic Heideggerians, etc., etc. So get ready to learn about what the hell analytic philosophy is today. It's not my area of specialty, so I probably am going to ask a lot of annoying questions. I hope that's okay, but maybe in the off chance that others listening don't know about it, they will learn from my ignorance. Let's hope that that is the case. With all of that said, again, welcome, and tell us why you chose to write a social history of analytic philosophy.
Actually, a way into answering that question is just to pick up on the very last thing that you were saying about, treating the audience as if they don't know anything about analytic philosophy. And of course, it's, that's a good idea because we're here to really try and lay it out. And I've got the platform to lay it out in my way and talk about how I do it in the book. But the comment that sort of occurs to me instantly is actually a large part of the audience of people who don't know much about analytic philosophy are actually analytic philosophers. And this is a very interesting feature of analytic philosophy as a kind of formation. I mean, we can talk about exactly how to talk about it. Is it a discipline? Is it a school? Is it a movement? And of course, if you're an analytic philosopher, as we'll see, I guess, more and more as we try to refine in a way what holds it all together as being analytic philosophy, these are people who care a great deal about definitions,
precision, right.
Characterizations, necessary and sufficient conditions, and so on. So to them, it's going to be very important. The differences between movements and schools and so on might really come into it. But anyway, this kind of what does present itself when one does a history like the kind of history I did as a phenomenon or as a thing with quite a bit of unity to it. It's very much characterized by I mean, the grand word, I guess, ahistoricism, but anyway, kind of lack of not only awareness, but really lack of interest in where one's own way of going about things intellectually comes from and what its ancestry is and so on. So there's a kind of analytic philosophy in a way is a very interesting thing to write about because it has this peculiarity that it's so unconcerned with its own formation that even to just the act of doing a bit of sort of archaeology of how it's come about is almost immediately really illuminating actually of what it is today. So I mean, in the 1990s, we started to get a series of kind of scholarly works by analytic philosophers about the history of analytic philosophy, and that was a really big change. So there's actually a wonderful book which I would recommend to people with a serious interest in philosophy, which is Peter Hilton's book from 1990 on Bertrand Russell, and how Russell's work grew out of a very different kind of philosophy from what he himself advocated, right, which is idealism. So Russell, very early on, having been a mathematics student at Cambridge, then converted to being a philosophy student, essentially, and in the very earliest phase, he came under the influence of idealist philosophers, particularly Bradley, who was an Oxford philosopher, and then a guy called John Ellis McTaggart, who was a don at Cambridge, only a bit older actually than Russell, but was somebody that he talked to and was deeply influenced by. And Hilton's book was a kind of turning point for analytic philosophers because it started to open up the idea that there was a history, and that history was really confined to the beginnings. So when you said, so I do begin before the Vienna Circle really gets going, and so where I begin is 1898, which is in Cambridge with Russell and Moore. And so a lot of that history, kind of scholarly history of analytic philosophy, has remained confined actually to that quite early period. And then more recently, there have been people like a prominent Oxford philosopher, Timothy Williamson, has started to ask questions about, why haven't we done a history of all the things happened in the 1970s, which is a really important period for analytic philosophy. So people are sort of starting a bit to catch up with the idea that this is something that has a history, but it's really characterized as one of its key features is this ahistoricism. So Ernst Mach, who was an American philosopher who went to Vienna and other Austrian cities and Polish cities in the 1930s and sort of reported back on this and wrote a big double journal article, which was one of the first uses actually of the term analytic philosophy. In the title of that article, he said one of the main features that he picked out of how people did philosophy in these European universities was that they were actively uninterested in the history of the subject, and that was really radical and really new.
So in that sense, can you talk about the way that perhaps master figures of German idealism, perhaps if you don't mind, given your Hegel background, at its origin in the late 19th century, and I don't know how much you address this in the book, but is there not a type of wrestling with the Hegelian sort of presence or Hegelian legacy, and sort of that might be helpful. I mean, we've done some programs on Hegel and Hegelianism, largely through Marx, and how Marxists read Hegel. But perhaps you say, how do the early analytics treat Hegel? That's one question I had for you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because the British situation at the end of the 19th century in the universities where philosophy was taught is a very specific situation. And so actually, I mean, Hegel plays a really important role for the English or British stream of what feeds into what becomes analytic philosophy. In a way, it's actually not so important for the Austrians. So I mean, what I mean by that is that in the late 19th century in Britain, Hegelianism had this, as like extraordinary flourishing at a time when there wasn't the same interest in certainly in Germany. I mean, Marx was actually kind of outlier, right? And Marx finds himself having to say things like please don't treat Marx as a dead dog.
Right. Right.
An old trope from German intellectual circles. And so Marx is sort of still insisting on the importance of Hegel.
Yes.
Masterful thinker, he calls him. So in Germany, the basic trend is a certain kind of materialism, not much interest in Hegel. But Britain has this kind of curious intellectual landscape where there's a number of really prominent Hegel-inspired philosophers, and F.H. Bradley, I think, is probably the most important. And then there's McTaggart, who I also mentioned, and there's a whole series of other figures. And they're also, I mean, this is, I guess, for another show, but there's a kind of very interesting, variegated picture there where there's some very conservative Hegelians.
Right.
Called Grote in Cambridge, who's really responsible for a very politically conservative reading of Hegel. Whereas in Oxford, there's a man, T.H. Green, who was described by Collingwood in the 20th century as having been somebody that had kind of hugely marked Oxford philosophy, not in the way it was often thought, which was just he sort of poisoned everyone's minds with idealism, but the really important thing about Green and also his wife was that they were enormously politically progressive, and they saw Hegelianism as kind of linked with the whole way of thinking about how Britain should be run. And of course, the effect was because Oxford was a training ground for people who then went to run the British civil service and so on. It did actually have the effect that people imbibed Hegelian ideas. So the kind of thing I mean is a kind of organicist conception of the state, right? And what now, I guess the jargon's communitarianism, as opposed to kind of individualist liberalism. So these Hegelians were sort of a threat to the empiricist strand. So people like John Stuart Mill. At the time, there was this sort of opposition between them. The thing that's interesting about Russell and Moore to me is that there's a really prevalent mischaracterization of what they themselves called the rebellion against idealism, which Russell wrote many autobiographies, and in them he's always saying the same thing, which is in 1898, Moore and I carried out the rebellion against idealism. Moore led this, and that's correct when you look at what they wrote at the time. Moore was really the leading figure, and Russell was following. Partly because Russell was principally interested in mathematical logic. He was less interested in philosophy. But the kind of mischaracterization is, well, there was this great big sort of monolithic Hegelian tradition which dominated British intellectual life. And Russell and Moore decided to stand up to this thing. So that's actually not true, because Russell and Moore were at Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, where there were 4 people who taught philosophy. Only 4. They were, I can remember all their names and rattle them off. So there's McTaggart, there's James Ward, there was a man called G.F. Stout, who was largely a psychologist, and then there was Henry Sidgwick. Sidgwick, one of the most famous and prominent utilitarians. So Ward and Stout, spent some time in Germany, and they knew about German ideas, but it was much more kind of recent work in psychology that was what interested them. So actually, McTaggart was the only one who was a Hegelian. And what happened with Russell and Moore was, when they were in their early 20s, they were, I suppose, transfixed by McTaggart's intellectual personality, and they became idealists under McTaggart's influence. And then within about 3 or 4 years, they rebel against that. So they're actually not rebelling against, a whole sort of huge weight of Hegelianism.
Even though that's what they said they were doing, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Russell doesn't even quite say that, but it gets into it.
Kind of implied as the myth of the transition. Okay, so I want to ask you now to introduce the Vienna Circle and in general, and just as a side point on this notion of how I love, Horkheimer appears and the Frankfurt School appears in dialogue with elements here, and the question of logical positivism in the debates, and the early budding what would become analytic philosophers have a rejection of dialectics. And it reminded me of Horkheimer's very interesting book, which was called The Eclipse of Reason, which really took on a number of logical positivism, took on pragmatism, took on Thomism, took on kind of like all sort of conservative instantiations of philosophy that he saw as problematic. And this was written later. So anyways, that's a side point. That's a secondary point. But perhaps we could begin by you explaining what the Vienna, it's a very well-known and very important assortment of thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
How did it come about and who was involved?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing to say, just to connect it to the Cambridge story, actually the way to connect it is by contrast, I think. Cambridge was a very small place. It was a university, a very monastic university with this very small number of philosophers. And what More was really up to was quite technical arguments about the nature of judgment. So sort of what you might now call philosophy of mind and metaphysical questions. So the Vienna background is hugely different to that. Firstly, in that Vienna was this great metropolitan city, an enormous cultural center. So we're talking about, the Vienna of Freud, Klimt, Hofmannsthal, Kokoschka, Arnold Schoenberg, Adolf Loos, right? All of these kind of
sort of the capital of intellectual life in the world at the time.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I mean, this kind of incredibly buzzing place. And you mentioned in your introduction, I think, that the cafe culture, in which the cafe culture was really truly interdisciplinary.
Right.
That the whole point of the kind of intellectual meetings that people had in Vienna was for people who did different sorts of things to talk to each other.
Outside of the seminar room. The seminar room was the street and kind of bled into, that's beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Vienna Circle, so-called, is, sort of one of these cafe discussion groups. So scholars of the Vienna Circle talk about the proto-circle, which I think starts in about 1908. There's a small group of scientists and intellectuals who meet together. But what we know is the Vienna Circle, interestingly, is set up in 1924 by a man called Moritz Schlick, who was actually a German, and had studied, he'd done his PhD in physics, and his supervisor was a man called Max Planck. So, he came to Vienna sort of as not just as a physicist, but as somebody, working at the forefront of physics. And Schlick in 1924 sets up this discussion group that's at first known as the Schlick Circle, and later one of the members of the Vienna Circle that's bound to be the most interesting to me and who's very prominent in my book, Otto Neurath, who was now, one might say, a Marxist. He saw his own views as something like functionally equivalent to Marxism, even though they're actually quite unorthodox, but he was certainly the most left-wing. And Neurath later...
And he was he part of the Mach Society as well?
Yeah, so...
how does that play in? Because we obviously have Lenin and Lenin's critique of imperial criticism kind of in the background here in some way, which I find very interesting. You know what I mean? Especially because Red Vienna, and if you read Trotsky's biography, Trotsky was always in Red Vienna, in and out, right? Mm-hmm. And so the Bolshevik ideas permeated that space, right? It was a porous space, right? Cosmopolitan space. Yeah. And so, but Machism was the great enemy to materialist dialectics, according to Lenin, obviously, right? So could you briefly mention that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. It connects actually very nicely with the question of what is the Vienna Circle, because so as I mentioned, it's initially known as the Schlick Circle, and this is basically a reading group on Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Strangely enough, they read it in their own particular way. But that becomes called the Vienna Circle when Neurath comes up with this term. And that happens at a particular moment in its history, which is quite interesting. I think it's 1936, when the Vienna Circle enters what's often called its public phase. So Neurath and Carnap, Rudolf Carnap, another philosopher and a a mathematician called Hans Hahn, they write this thing that's become known as the Manifesto of the Vienna Circle. And that's where the phrase the Vienna Circle is first used. And that date is the same date as the foundation of the Ernst Mach Society, which you refer to. Right, so the Ernst Mach Society is this kind of public organ, which immediately becomes very important because right, the society as a sort of public institution gets shut down by the Nazis right, when they come to power. So it's considered it's sort of putting itself out there very quickly leads to it then being closed down. So Ernst Mach, to signal like why is it the Ernst Mach Society and what's that got to do with?
Yeah, and
Mach.
what is that all about? What is
yeah? So Mach,
I have a vague idea, but I mean I'm very curious.
So Mach is a kind of forerunner of some of these people in the circle. So it's true of basically everyone in the circle, and it's really, really important about them that they're practicing scientists.
Right.
And scientists quite broadly, so including sociologists and various other kind of disciplines. But they're not philosophers in the sense that we often understand people to be philosophers now, which is they specialize in philosophizing, but they don't specialize in anything. From the point of view, philosophy looks kind of first order, right, discipline. And Mach is important as a forerunner in that he's appointed to a chair at the University of Vienna in 1896, which is a complicated history about the chair, which you could read about in the book. But there were various chairs of philosophy at the University of Vienna, which had been vacant for numerous years, in one case, I think decades. And there are complicated reasons for that, which are interesting. But what happens in 1896 is that due to the influence of various powerful people, it's decided that this one of these chairs should become a chair basically for physics and inductive science. And Ernst Mach is installed in this chair. And this is the beginning of a certain kind of notion of scientific philosophy, right? Where scientific philosophy means something like, well, the natural sciences are the sources of our knowledge, essentially. The natural sciences are demonstrably successful. And you have to think this is a period of kind of extraordinary rapidity of progress in physics in particular. So scientific philosophy becomes a thing with Ernst Mach. And Mach, so to connect it to Lenin and Lenin's visceral critique of Mach and a guy with similar views in Zurich called Avenarius. Lenin picks up on a feature of Mach's work, which is, if you now look at the way people write about Mach, sort of in the scholarship, and the scholarship tends to be people that are appreciative of his work, they really, really play down, so the scholars really play down the so-called phenomenalism. Right? So phenomenalism is basically the view, particularly in the domain of natural science, but in general, the view that what we should study is the phenomena in the sense of what's available to the senses, and that one had better not claim that there's anything more than that, or anything sort of behind the appearances, right, or whatever it is, it's sort of underlying the sensations as they're given to us. And the idea is, of course, is that you could do natural science as a kind of system in which the part of it's the registration of inputs, which is the kind of the establishing of data, and you feed these into a theory, and then the theory is used to make predictions, and those predictions are predictions about further things that are measurable or observable, and so in principle by the senses or maybe through instruments, but in any case observable phenomena. And it doesn't really matter what happens in between, right? So long as you're registering what you're able to pick up produces a theory, or can be fed into a theory that then generates like very, very successful predictions. And this is what was happening in the sciences. The level of success was sort of on an exponential curve. Then the temptation is to say, well, there aren't any so to use Kantian language, maybe they're only things in themselves. There are just a phenomena. So that thesis is phenomenalism. The scholars now deny that Mach ever held this view. So they say very sophisticated things like, well, Mach sort of was a phenomenalist in the sense that he thought we'd better not say anything about the things themselves. But if you read Mach, he actually says, no, there's just the appearances. The thing in itself is just nonsense. He also has this view that there's no such thing as the self, which is very interesting. And that's interesting partly because it was very, very influential in literary circles. So there are these Austrian writers in Vienna who belong to this group called Young Vienna, who talk about this catchphrase that Mach had, which is something like the ego is unsavable, or the ego is unsalvageable. And that was their sort of watchword. So Mach is kind of, very influential in kind of complicated ways. But yeah, so what Lenin is picking up on is the sort of parallel between Mach and someone like 18th century Anglo-Irish philosopher George Berkeley, famous for thinking that there are just ideas and that there are material objects is a kind of confusion.
Right. Is it a stretch to say that Lenin's criticism of Mach in Imperial Criticism book, which is a book that is highly criticized and which many Marxists are not comfortable with, especially given, I think, based on advances in science and other things, it's perceived as highly dated to its time. But does it stand perhaps as sort of like a prototypical criticism of analytic philosophy in utero, in some sense, given that all of these people were Machians at the time?
Yeah, I don't know. It was really interesting reading the Lenin book because I'd looked at it before, at some point. I thought I'll dip into that. But having to actually sort of develop a view about Lenin's critique and whether it hits its target, it's a very mixed experience because, this book, it's a very blunt instrument. And, Lenin he just takes everything that he's got and throws it at the Machians, and there's an enormous amount of rhetoric, part of which is quite fun. But there's something, I think, actually much more respectable about it than I think people are sort of, in the habit of saying. It's treated with a certain kind of contempt sometimes. And I think that the thing that's valuable in it is that I think Lenin's very alive to the temptation among Marxists, particular Russian Marxists of the time, some who had gone to Zurich to study with Avenarius, who was this kind of other Machist. There was a sort of temptation to get drawn into sort of hyper-empiricist and possibly idealist in the sort of Berkeleyan sense program. So not idealist in the Hegelian sense, but sort of idealist in the sense of where there are just sensations or just, mental items or whatever. There are only material things. Because you could sort of see why people were drawn into it and why it produced a sort of fault line within Marxism. Because in a way, so something that the Vienna Circle are very exercised about later, which is the idea of kind of, a certain kind of overblown metaphysics that might introduce entities like the folk and various kind of dubious ideological constructs that sort of grip the masses. That metaphysics could be used as a sort of instrument of oppression, basically. And so the thing is to be against that. And if you want to be against that, it seems like being sort of hyper-scientific and saying, well, we must just stick to, what the natural sciences tell us, can seem quite like it's on the side of certainly progressive politics, but maybe even a revolutionary movement that's trying to shake off the shackles of the kind of possibly obscuring and mystifying kind of ideology of a certain kind of ruling class. So I think Lenin's very alive to that, and I think the bits that are good about the book are the bits that that illuminate that. And it's it's true. I mean, he makes these very kind of banal points in a way, which is at some point he says Marx and Engels were materialists. So these people can't be on our side, and that's it. Sorry, you're muted, I think.
It falls into a polemical style that Lenin, I think, is sort of reflective of a highly polemical political context, which, of course, yeah, hearing you describe it from the vantage that you are describing it and sort of dignifying the effort might merit a sort of essay, right? Which is to sort of like kind of take a sort of an approach to an analysis of Lenin's criticism of Marxism, sort of removed from some of the specificities of that make it anachronistic or that make it of its time, and so that's a whole separate thing. Let me now move to ask you about how and why the early Frankfurt School enters the picture. So that's one thing I'd like for you to explain, the correspondence that you discuss with Horkheimer in particular, I think others too. And I also wanted to ask you to sort of describe what was the Vienna Circle sort of reading of the Tractatus by Wittgenstein. I think you had mentioned that, but perhaps it might be a useful way, given that this was their impetus of convening, at least initially. I feel that that's probably important for us to sort of throw up and say how they were reading this text by Wittgenstein.
Yeah, so their reading of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, certainly the easy thing to say about it is it wasn't how Wittgenstein saw it himself. I mean, he got very, very... well, Wittgenstein was a person who was easily irritated. And this group, I think he didn't like sort of intellectual groups of this kind either, actually. This idea that there was this group trying to figure out what he thought. I think he thought even was distasteful, but he thought they just got it catastrophically wrong. And I suppose the thing that they got so wrong must have been that they gave the Tractatus a basically empiricist reading. So they thought, one of the key ideas of the Tractatus is that there are things that we can talk about, things that are sayable, and they can be articulated in propositions or sentences. Right? And then there's a whole realm that's beyond the sayable. So in the phrase is the things that can only be shown and not said. And it's a really central commitment of Wittgenstein's Tractatus that these things that cannot be said, the unsayable, is actually the really important stuff. And this is very distinctive of his view, that he thought that, so for example, ethical, aesthetic, and religious truths. And it's interesting that they're truths if they can't be said, and exactly what that means. But anyway, these important precepts, precepts is probably really wrong as well. But anyway, these important things, right? The most important things about human life. And Wittgenstein thought that art, I think, was at least as important as ethics, and he thought religion was also tremendously important. That these things were somehow belonged to what he called the mystical. So they could not be expressed in language, but they could be expressed in other ways. So Wittgenstein has this kind of demarcation, right, between what can be said and what can be shown. And the Vienna Circle basically took this as a demarcation between science, right, the propositions that can be established on the basis of science, and then a whole load of other stuff, which was basically nonsense, called metaphysics. And they were against that. And your other question was about the connection with the Frankfurt School.
Yes.
I placed a lot of emphasis earlier on the year 1924, that this was when the Schlick Circle was first formed, right? The thing that then becomes known as the Vienna Circle. Because one of the striking things is that the Frankfurt School, or the Institute for Social Research, was founded in the exact same year in 1924.
Right.
So they have a parallel history, and they're sort of both, in a sense, extra institutional groupings, slightly different ways in terms of how they're funded and run and so on, but they are, on the fringes of great universities.
Right.
In case of Frankfurt, a very new university. In the case of Vienna, much older. And yeah, they sort of curiously have quite a lot in common. I mean, in a way, it's just sort of because of historical circumstance that when you get the rise of Nazism, it doesn't take that much in a way to have common cause between intellectual movements insofar as they're opposed to that, and insofar as they have
But what I found really interesting, though, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that for a moment there was a consideration on behalf of the Frankfurt School theorists, philosophers, etc., to take seriously logical positivism, and that was considered at this early stage, but that didn't quite go well, right?
Yeah, I mean,
we haven't introduced logical positivism conceptually or defined it. We should do that, but perhaps that correspondence, maybe, is that why you chose to focus on it? Because it kind of shows that Red Vienna was a kind of inescapably left-wing socialistic milieu, but yet somehow the formation socially and politically of what would become analytic philosophy at this stage, as it's developing its sense of identity as a group or whatever, is not capable of absorbing that radicalism that is already in the air. That's my interpretation of why you chose to do that, but perhaps I'm missed the mark. I don't know.
Well, let's characterize logical positivism, because that's would be helpful. And I'm going to keep using the term logical positivism, which a lot of analytic philosophers don't like, because they say, well, it should really be called logical empiricism. Well, the term logical positivism was introduced by one of its leading figures, Herbert Feigl, in a paper that he co-wrote with a guy called Blumberg, who's very interesting because he was actually a communist. But that's another story. Logical positivism means basically Machism, so this kind of emphasis on what the natural sciences can tell us, like treating them as a kind of canon of rational inquiry. So it's in line with the empiricist tradition. Plus, and then the logical bit is it's making use of the tools of what at the time is often called logistic, or the new logic, which comes out of the work of a man we haven't mentioned yet, Gottlob Frege. So there's this great series of advances in formal logic that happened at the end of the 19th century, and the logical positivists are picking up on that, and so they're trying to put these two things together. And in fact, one of the key components of Horkheimer's critique of the logical positivists, just to skip ahead a little bit, is that there's something sort of inherently unstable about this combination of the two things, the logical and the positivism. Because if you take classical empiricists, so people in the sort of positivistic tradition, someone like John Stuart Mill, they say things about, for example, mathematics, that they think even mathematics is an empirical science. So 2 + 2 = 4 is an empirical generalization. That seems very implausible, but they felt they had to say that, because if you're an empiricist, you thought that all of the sources of knowledge were in sensation. So there couldn't be some kind of special mathematical faculty by which you could know things. But the logical positivists tried to combine this conception of logic with the empiricism, and Horkheimer says this can't really work. Influenced, by the way, very strongly by Adorno. So when Horkheimer decides to write this polemical critique of the Vienna people, which is called The Latest Attack on Metaphysics, he's engaged in this correspondence with Adorno, who's actually in Oxford as an exile, working on some sort of a second doctoral dissertation or some sort of somewhat fictitious project under the supervision of a man called Gilbert Ryle, who is one of the key figures of Oxford philosophy. So, and very much a proto-analytic philosopher. And so Adorno is sitting there in Oxford, going to these various seminars at which people like Ryle are around, and he's sort of feeding him these lines like, why don't you try this angle of criticism, try this other angle of criticism. And quite a lot of the stuff that comes from Adorno ends up in the essay that Horkheimer writes. But I guess you also wanted to know about why it might be, intellectually that there was this prospect for collaboration.
Yeah. Why did that dissolve, or why did that not work out? Is my question. Yeah.
Yeah. Question why precisely it failed is actually quite a complex question, because some of it is to do with just world events taking over, because it's all happening in the period. A lot of this sort of happening around 1939 in the United States, actually, and there are these meetings. There are basically meetings sort of scheduled to take place by members of both sides to discuss, in particular, this vexed question of dialectic, which you mentioned, and the meetings just get cancelled because war breaks out. So that's one sort of.
So it's kind of a two ships passing in the night scenario due to the crisis of the war, and then afterwards, the Frankfurt School. Really, their history is they never find an institutional home, and they are kind of exiled permanently, I guess you could say, which probably was better for their scholarly output, in my opinion. Maybe they didn't see it that way at the time, because they desperately wanted an academic security. They never really got it.
Yeah, I mean, of course, also the substantive disagreement about dialectic is really important.
Yes,
we have these meetings, and
of course,
there are some people like Sidney Hook, who'd been a Marxist, but then turned into a headhunter.
Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason touches on this too, which is that he's saying, he's criticizing the early dominance of what we would eventually call analytic philosophy in American academia at the time, and he's saying they're sort of foreclosing the possibility of speculative thought completely. So there's a lot to this thing. I feel like we introduced the Frankfurt School interaction, and we introduced Machism and Leninism. It is interesting, by the way, that Mach has so much power at the time, but now when you look back, he's kind of like a Feuerbach figure, in the sense that Feuerbach also had that power, but we've sort of forgotten him. And maybe it's a fact that when a Marxist sharpens their knife at you, you better be careful, because they could erase you from history if you're not careful. But given our somewhat limitations on time, I don't know if there's more you wanted to say about Vienna Circle. I wanted to make a slight pivot, if we could.
Sure.
Okay. Collingwood is a figure that sort of initiates the label for the first time, and he's an interesting figure because a friend of mine is actually doing work on him. He was a historian, right? And he developed almost like a philosophical theory of historicism, if I'm not mistaken, that's sort of with an analytic thrust. And of all of the figures that you discuss, I feel that he may be one who's, if not redeemable, a very, I don't know, of an outlier. You seem to treat him kind of kindly.
Yeah, you're right.
Tell me about Collingwood for a moment. That's a peculiar question, and then we'll move to a bigger one.
I mean, I wouldn't, I think, characterize Collingwood as an analytic philosopher. So he's in Oxford, but he's doing something quite different. He wouldn't have been happy to have been called an idealist, because I think he saw himself as very distinct from the idealist heritage as well. But yeah, as you say, he's one of the first people to use the phrase analytic philosophy in print. And when he does it, he's essentially grouping together various people in Cambridge. So a peculiarity of the history is actually that 1945, Oxford is a sort of not obviously analytic picture, whereas Cambridge, it's very clear because of the dominance of G.E. Moore, actually. Russell, not so much, because after the First World War, Russell disappears from the academic scene and starts doing other things. But so Collingwood is sort of bound to be complex. Well, it's at least possible that there's someone in Oxford who holds an important chair in philosophy, as Collingwood does, without that person being an analytic philosopher. And I think it's really crucial to what makes Collingwood both so interesting and what makes him somebody with a certain kind of immunity to analytic tendencies in philosophy is that he was, as you said, a historian. And I mean, he was very much both a historian and a philosopher, and also an archaeologist. So he wrote this book on Roman Britain. And he was really a top-class professional archaeologist. And
Wow.
he was fascinated by questions about how to think about history and what sort of thing history is, where he was very influenced by Italian idealists.
Yeah, I like to think of him as like Spangler done properly or something like that. Because he's kind of driven by some of the same questions of Spangler, but Spangler is like a fundamental fascist irrationalist, right? He's like some. I mean, yeah, he's Nietzschean, but he's like worse than a Nietzschean. He's like off on his own. Nietzsche would actually really, I think, hate Spangler, in my opinion. Side point, but
I was going to say much less horrible than Spengler. And Spengler, interestingly, just to get this in, a major influence on Wittgenstein. So there's a
say that again.
Spengler, major influence on Wittgenstein. I mean, somebody that he really admired.
No kidding.
Yeah, absolutely. So Oswald Spengler and Otto Weininger are two really important cultural figures that influenced Wittgenstein. And I think that's worth saying because there's this sort of,
I had no idea.
There's a sort of sanitized version of some figures in analytic philosophy. And one of them is Wittgenstein, where the idea is that Wittgenstein was not just a progressive, but he was actually some kind of a bit of a Marxist in some way. This is completely false because
people like to say that, don't they?
Yeah, insofar as we know Wittgenstein's political views, he was a quite deep reactionary, and he went to the Soviet Union, but because he had very specific ideas about wanting to do manual labor in the Soviet Union, and because he wanted to I don't know, embody the sort of Tolstoyan ideal of utter simplicity. And the person in the employment agency in Russia said, "Well, there are various positions for you, but they're all professorships of philosophy." And he said he didn't want that, so he went home again. Sorry,
that is actually quite interesting because in the Spenglerian view, there is this notion against the idleness of the bureaucratic professional and the cultivation of what he would call like the man of action, right? And in germinal form, you do see that in Nietzsche, of the thinker must be beyond the university in some sense. So that's a very interesting point about Wittgenstein. So we have Cambridge, Oxford, Vienna. Can we now introduce, I guess, as it were, the United States into the picture? Because after the Second World War, things seem to shift to the U.S. as the cauldron or the center of what would become the dominance of what we know as analytic philosophy, and the fact that somebody in you reference in the book said every philosophy department in the U.S. is dominated by analytic philosophy, but there's only a handful of analytic philosophers. I love that phrase. It's so true, and it remains true. And you talk about, and there's been a fair amount written, I think, about this in some sense, several books we could reference. Yeah, about the Cold War, right? And about anti-communism, right? And which you show in an interesting way, and I think important way, is that even though a lot of these academic analytic philosophers in America were not even in the arena of flirting with socialism or communist ideas. They were still persecuted by the state.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very telling, right? Because it shows the exaggerated basis by which the US state apparatus policed the direction of philosophy. So I suppose tell us about that context, the Cold War, the Red Scare, and how the analytic continental divide emerges out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you say, I mean, the emphasis shifts to the United States, and in part that's because many of the leading figures of analytic philosophy as it becomes in the United States after the Second World War are European emigres. So in large part, they're the same people that come over. And it's just incredibly striking that a group of, as I described them before, it's a practicing scientists who had been part of this group where there was a range of political views, and Schlick was a little bit more to the right than some of the others, but certainly Neurath and Carnap were members of the Social Democrat Party, and they were very much concerned with social issues and so on. When they come to the United States, very quickly, they become this completely different thing, which is that they become philosophers of science. Sorry, Schlick doesn't come, but the ones that make it across. Herbert Feigl, another really important figure. Hans Reichenbach, who's from Berlin, from the Berlin Circle, which is a sort of sister organization, you might say. They become philosophers of science, and philosophy of science is this discipline that sort of no one knew existed before. They're not physicists sort of thinking about the foundations of physics while pursuing their scientific work. They're actually sort of stepping back and asking these questions about what is scientific method, how does it work, and so on. And as they do that, their whole sort of philosophical way of doing things gets evacuated of political. It's got a political dimension, just disappears. And so then the question is how to understand that. And I mean, what I tried to do in the book is I tried to give a kind of quite broad picture of the climate in the US. So the climate is basically, the US is the country in the world that wins the war, sort of, more than any other. Its main contestant, obviously, is the Soviet Union, which it had been allied with, which liberated much of Europe and so on. But the Soviet Union is now, and sorry, to kind of rehearse, what's familiar, but the Soviet Union becomes, in the eyes of the Americans, the main threat. And work has to be done to figure out, how to combat this largely imagined threat from the Soviet Union. And they're the people that are the analytic philosophers, or who will soon, emerge as that. Are particularly useful because they're very amenable to the development at this point quite recent of rational choice theory and game theory, which are these highly technical fields which sort of straddle mathematics and economics. And as I show in the book, there's a number of really prominent analytic philosophers, the ones that are famous now if you've been exposed to philosophy in an English-speaking university. So people like W.W. Quine and Donald Davidson, also Hans Reichenbach, Alfred Tarski, the Polish logician. These people all worked at RAND.
Yeah.
Had come out of so it stands for Research and Development, right? Which was it had come out of military. It was basically research, the research arm of the American military, and then becomes the research arm of the Cold War effort. So they're sort of embedded within this, and then there's the McCarthyite purges, which have this effect of this kind of immense chilling effect. Because if you think about it, we have the stories of the people that were actually dragged in front of committees, often actually internal university committees, which tended to be even worse than the proper. So the House Un-American Activities Committee and various others, the Rap Kudat Committee. There's a whole series of them where people were, they were technically witnesses, or they were technically just, called upon to give testimony, but they were actually, treated as defendants. They were treated as accused. That was bad enough. But if you got, if your university had sort of taken the preemptive step of trying to sort of filter out, these troublesome people, communists, who were very dangerous to the universities, because the idea was, the rationalization was, well, a communist is somebody who doesn't have their own mind because they're controlled by the Soviet Union. It's kind of Manchurian Candidate picture. So given that you didn't have your own mind and you were just controlled by the Soviet Union, you were a danger to the university because you were a danger to free thinking, because you were just controlled, sort of robotically controlled from outside. So there's one of the cases, interesting case of Barrows Dunham, who was a social philosopher who got called in front of one of these committees. He said his treatment at his own university he was even more hurt by, and this sort of damaged him for the rest of his life. Just how that kind of, the sort of pre-screening committees that universities themselves instituted, how they worked. And it has this chilling effect because, you never know if it's going to be you next. And there were so many people who were really genuinely radical in the 1930s. Many of them had been members of the Communist Party. Of course, you didn't have to have been a member of the Communist Party in order to be a communist, as I just described, as a person that was controlled by the Soviet Union. But actually, many of them were. And it's interesting writing about this phenomenon, even now, about McCarthyism, which has this much longer shadow. I mean, we still have it now, I think, in some sense. It's not a 1950s phenomenon. It lasts much, much longer because people take these secrets and so on with them about, who they stabbed in the back and so on.
Yeah.
It's interesting writing about that because you realize actually how much of what happened in the 30s is really still sort of covered over by this sort of fog of unknowing.
Yeah.
It's not that difficult to find out if you just go and look in the archives or do a bit of reading of history books. And there are great books like Ellen Schrecker's book, No Ivory Tower, which is about universities. It's full of information that you would need to see actually just how polarized things were in the 30s. You were basically, you're either a socialist / communist or you'd just sort of given up.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a particular question about this part of your book, The Making of Analytic Philosophy, the chapter we're discussing right now, and that is about Wilfrid Sellars, because perhaps later, for one of my later questions about what may be salvageable, redeemable, and redemptive, and potentially useful for, let's say, Marxist approaches to philosophy, right? Well, as you know, Wilfrid Sellars is an American analytic philosopher who is part of coining and institutionalizing analytic philosophy in the late 40s. And you talk about that. And he's famous for this concept of the myth of the given. I say that because contemporary philosophers like Carl Sachs and Ray Brassier and many others have tried to fuse Sellars with Marx. The Pittsburgh School, right? Yeah. And so out of this milieu, you sort of have a full court press of repression. You have the Walter Lippmann Conference, which is kind of instantiating and codifying liberalism as inescapable for intellectual life in America, let's say. You have rational choice theory, game theory, two systems deeply tied into the U.S. state project. you have McCarthyism. And so it's like miserable, really, right? I mean, it's not a surprise that this is happening. What I think is very interesting, though, is that the autonomy of science was derived earlier, and that's kind of imported, right?
Mhm.
And you can see why it would that then meets your apolitical theme right there, right? But perhaps you could mention a few things about Wilfrid Sellars in this context for folks that want to approach analytic philosophy in a constructive way. Is he sort of like Collingwood, an outlier, if that makes sense?
I think he can't be an outlier because of what you said before, which is that he was, in a way, one of the central figures who made analytic philosophy be what it has been. Which he did partly, but he collaborated with Herbert Feigl on this big anthology that was used in universities. And they wrote to all the philosophers that they knew who were sort of on the kind of analytic side, where analytics still meant, either Cambridge or Vienna or Poland or these various things, or maybe some of the pragmatists in America. Some among the pragmatists. Whereas, I mean, it's worth mentioning, right, that if we're talking about 1948, 49, most American philosophers are still something other than any of these things, right? So
they're Jamesians or Deweyians.
Yeah, or grand speculative idealists, or they're kind of Thomist historians, all sorts of things. Very variegated picture. So I think Sellars can't be an outlier, but I think Sellars, you're right to pick up on that he's a very interesting and unusual figure. And of course, writing about analytic philosophers as individuals, which is what I do spend quite a lot of the book on, because although it's a social history, it's important to its reproduction of itself, that actually it's often led by kind of intellectually charismatic figures. So the personalities are really important. And some of these are just very interesting, extremely smart and insightful thinkers. Some of them really pushing at the boundaries of their own discipline. And that's part of what makes it really interesting to read them. And so Sellars apparently had some interest in Marxism as a teenager in Paris. So he grew up in Paris part of the time.
I think he was also father was a leftist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So Roy Wood Sellars, who
I believe so.
Yeah, who was into a thing called, I think they might have even called it at this time, the new materialism or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, Roy Wood Sellars certainly saw himself as aligned with the left in his philosophical work. So Sellars...
So he's very comparable, actually, to Richard Rorty in that sense, because Rorty comes from a famous left-wing family. Yeah. He's like a red diaper baby and so on. But we'll talk about Rorty in later.
Yeah. So I suppose what I would say about Sellars is I would try to pick out quite specific aspects of his contribution. And you mentioned the myth of the given. So this is a kind of major assault on empiricism, essentially. So the myth. So Sellars thinks it's perfectly true that there are things that are given to us in experience, in the sense that, I mean, if you have your eyes open, you'll see things and so on, and this is processed by us. But the idea of the myth is that there's a kind of special status for a certain kind of most basic sensory contents, often called sense data, which could be, as the phrase used to be, the foundations for empirical knowledge. Right? We would build all of empirical knowledge on these special items of sense perception. And Sellars has these incredibly intricate, very beautiful arguments to kind of pick that apart. Very difficult writer, so, very kind of full of curlicues and sort of very particular style. So I think, and that the attack on the myth of the given has been really important for John McDowell, who I think is certainly many people would recognize as the most significant of the Pittsburgh school. I don't think he'd be happy with the label of Pittsburgh school. Anyway, one of the philosophers at Pittsburgh who's been most influential. And I suppose one thing to say about that is that a lot of what McDowell's doing with Sellars is driven by a sense of kind of recovering the contributions of Kant and Hegel. And Sellars' project is seen very much as amenable to that. So it's a way, so Sellars is helpful to McDowell, I think, in particular, because it's a way of taking on some of Sellars' insights, a way of kind of loosening up analytic philosophers for things that they traditionally have been not able to have any receptivity for, really.
I see.
Which one could link back to, how analytic philosophy, it's very obvious in a way when you look at the whole sweep of the history of philosophy, it really connects itself with an 18th century empiricist tradition.
Yeah.
And then there's a logic that's added, and that's a late 19th century thing. But in a way, it's very much continuous with David Hume.
Yeah.
And so you could easily tell a story where, continental philosophy, so-called, is, takes on Kant's critical philosophy, and then Hegel, and then everything that comes from that, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Derrida. Right?
Sure.
There's various strands, but there's a kind of all this that sort of comes from Kant and especially Hegel, and that analytic philosophy is not that. Let's come back.
Right.
So Sellars, I think, is helpful in that he prepares some of the ground, or he's a sort of gateway drug.
I'm very happy that you said that. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But you've just set the ground for my next question, actually, which is, where does this, I think, vulgar is the right word, sort of binary of continental versus analytic, which is it's just remarkable how powerful that binary is in the minds of young undergraduates. They almost feel, well, I need to decide, where do I stand? Am I on this side of the battle? Am I on this side? And then all of the stereotypes that come from that, most notably being that a continental philosopher is somebody who is jargon-filled and incoherent and imprecise. Yeah. Where the hell does all this come from?
Well, the answer to the question where it comes from, I mean, just in terms of what's its efficient cause, is analytic philosophers started to say this at a certain point with the people that were continental. I mean, it's a label invented by analytic philosophers.
In other words, it's them going to conferences of like French philosophers like Derrida and Deleuze, struggling to understand what's going on. And then I think you say like Merleau-Ponty comes to their conferences, and actually Merleau-Ponty is quite open to some rapport, but they're not, right? So the construct comes from the analytic side in the first instance, but it is a kind of hostile construct.
Very much a hostile construct.
Yeah. That's why I don't like it.
And it goes back.
Go on.
Certainly, you could find it deployed in the way that we're familiar with in the 50s. In the reports, when you read in journals, there are these reports of the World Congress of Philosophy, or these big meetings, and they'll report on the hostilities between the two sides, and it is a bit both ways. So I think so. There was this attempt by French philosophers to get the analytic philosophers over and have a conference devoted to la philosophie analytique.
Yeah, you mentioned this. Yeah,
in 1958 in a place called the Royaumont.
Yeah.
And there were quite tense discussions there that took place. And Merleau-Ponty, so interestingly, I know this just from a conversation with Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who was there as I think 26-year-old, very young philosopher, and partly because of being Canadian, he was very apt to act as the interpreter between the two sides. And he was able to tell me that, so we have the proceedings of this conference, which includes the discussions, which is incredibly valuable. But Taylor said to me, I didn't, include all of what was said because some of it was actually quite
awkward,
unprintable.
Yeah.
In the sense of just unpleasant. And Merleau-Ponty had actually been persuaded the evening before by the organizer of the conference to come, and he was very much not. He was not up for it. So he got a phone call like, please, can you come?
I see. Oh, so he was initially receptive. Yeah. I see. And all of this, eventually Derrida becomes the scapegoat, I suppose, which I don't really think he really deserved it. I mean, G.A. Cohen was so critical of Derrida, and I think, part of it's kind of in jest and funny, but a lot of it, frankly, was a bit exaggerated. In other words, this idea that Derrida is like speaks nonsense and that he develops these like empty concepts. It's not a charitable reading on the one hand, but it's also a reading which is disingenuous because it acknowledges that you refuse to read him. That's my problem with it. Yeah, but go on.
Yeah, the intensity about Derrida is just amazing. And Derrida, I think, was sort of singled out.
Well, there might be some jealousy because he transcended the academy. I mean, his popularity did. Perhaps there's a bit of a rivalrous spirit to it.
Yeah, there was a similar thing. I mean, earlier in the 20th century, Bertrand Russell's animus against Henri Bergson. A lot of this has to do, I think, with Bergson's, infuriating level of popularity.
Right.
Russell got very upset by it because Russell wanted to be that guy. So Russell found himself attending some dinner where Bergson was invited. And of course, Bergson was, not only the guest of honor, but it was all about Bergson. And Russell just had to show up as, second in command or something. But Derrida, it's very interesting how he's sort of treated as somebody that has to be sort of wheeled out. So several times he's invited to Oxford, and there's a sort of,
yeah, they kind of flay him, right?
Let's see what he does. Let's see. Yeah.
They try to make an example of him.
Extraordinary things are made up about him. Like there's a famous letter sent by a group of analytic philosophers in 1992 when the University of Cambridge decides to award Derrida an honorary doctorate. They take it upon themselves to say that Derrida is a charlatan and so on. And they say that he uses this word fallacies, where it's written PHALLUCIES, and that he's always talking about this. But Derrida actually never uses that word. So you would have thought these people who are terribly precise and rigorous might have, in a 80-word letter got this thing. But
it's very, very interesting. So so that's analytic continentalism. Obviously, there are some outliers, at least perhaps politically and socially, such as Rorty, a figure who I think is known as probably amongst the analytic community to possess, at least on liberal terms, about as sort of like as far as you can go within the paradigm of liberalism, where it butts up with a type of nascent socialistic Marxist orientation, but never goes all of the way. So I want to talk about that in a moment. But first, can you explain the linguistic turn and the myth of Frege? Obviously, for continental folks, we're familiar with the linguistic turn in a completely different valence, right? In a way, or is it sort of linked? In other words, like, how do you specify the linguistic turn for analytics, and then perhaps even for continentals? Is maybe two different things, or are they related?
Well, I feel that one of the reasons it's a very difficult question is that it's just very unclear what analytic philosophers mean by the linguistic turn.
That's one of your main arguments. True.
So, and then there's a question: what sense could be made? Historically speaking, what could one do with the idea productively to think about what it might mean? And so, I mean, the place where I ended up was.
But I will say this: for continental, is pretty kind of like indexed to like Saussure, right, and structural linguistics, and like even of grammatology, right? These texts that are like structuralism, and then post-structuralism. That's kind of how we link it.
Yeah.
That I'm familiar with, but I'm much less familiar with this. Please go on.
So I was going to say, was very much going to link,
and it's actually quite coherent, like that whole thing, you know, of Saussure, and like, because if you study Lacan and so on, like you can see why these choices are being made.
Yeah.
But here it's a different picture. Why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Saussure has a whole theory, which is an articulation of the idea of the linguistic turn interpreted a certain way. And I was going to link it with Derrida because it seems, I would say it seems clearer that Derrida and other people who are sort of influenced by Saussure in the relevant way undertake a linguistic turn, right? So whatever it means exactly to say there is no outside text, and I know that phrase is usually sort of used in isolation in a kind of incredibly misleading way. But there's a very, I guess I'd say, substantive notion of what it is to undertake the linguistic turn that's in play there. The figure in analytic philosophy where I ended up thinking it's quite plausible that there's really a sort of deep linguistic turn in a way analogous to Saussure is Wittgenstein, and specifically early Wittgenstein, because I think the Tractatus can be read in such a way, right? So that philosophy has to be done in some sense through language.
Right.
But what one generally finds in discussions of this is that analytic philosophers are actually very sloppy.
Well, you make a point that Wittgenstein cannot be the foundation of the linguistic turn because you get entangled in a bunch of contradictions that don't remain true to Wittgenstein's own project, which you earlier kind of summarized for us.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Right. And so that's an interesting side point about Wittgenstein as almost like having a inability to be systematized or something like that, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. But I thought that was an interesting point, that they get caught in a lot of contradictions, and it's like, so what's the true origin? What's the foundation of the linguistic turn? It's not clear.
Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of a historian, I guess it's it's possible to pinpoint where the talk of the linguistic turn gets going, and then ask what do people mean, or what sense can we make of it, and one leading way of thinking about it is introduced by Michael Dummett, who was an Oxford philosopher who, after the Second World War, he'd been away at war, and then he took up his studies in Oxford immediately after the Second World War, and he became really obsessed with the idea of trying to figure out what Gottlob Frege had really said and what he was really up to. So Frege, who we haven't really talked about, very important influence on both Russell and Wittgenstein. Himself a mathematician who worked in mathematical logic. Not really in his lifetime thought of as a philosopher particularly. I mean, he wrote some later essays that were very much philosophical in nature, but mathematics was basically what he was about. And Dummett became fascinated by Frege and thought, well, I'm going to sort of dig through his work to understand his philosophical project. And Dummett comes up with his interpretation of Frege, according to which Frege undertook this thing called the linguistic turn. And what Dummett meant by that was it was analogous in a way to what Descartes had done in the 17th century. So Descartes had undertaken an epistemological turn, which meant turning first philosophy, so like the foundational discipline of philosophy, from what it had been, which was metaphysics, right, or the study of being, into the study of knowledge. And so to begin from the question, what can I know? And this is the epistemological turn, which then sort of sets a whole tradition going in European philosophy. And Dummett thought that Frege had undertaken this extraordinary thing, which was something, again, on that kind of scale, to put philosophy through this revolution, for it to take a turn. This is the linguistic turn. And again, so on the model of the epistemological turn, it was to make first philosophy, so the foundational discipline of philosophy, the thing that you do first before you can do anything else, was going to be philosophy of language. And this was the sort of investigation that Frege himself did, which was the study of things like how it is that words refer to or denote things in the world, and the problems associated with that, conceived in a certain way. And what you get then is a picture. So you get a picture of Frege, which is very, very difficult to square with Frege's own writings, but becomes so influential that even the people that argue against Dummett, who are often going back to Frege's text and saying, but it's not actually there.
Wow.
Have to refer to Dummett as the standard reading, because Dummett's established this notion. Yeah. So here the linguistic turn means first philosophy, or this first thing is philosophy of language. And that's in a way relatively clear. It's just not very accurate about how, about the history of late 19th century philosophy. But often it's just this much more general thing as well. It's all somehow to do with language. And so, it often sort of remains nebulous. One of the things one must be very vigilant about, I think, is that analytic philosophers arrogate themselves the right to say, well, we're the ones that are precise and clear and rigorous. But, saying that doesn't make it so. And often there's a great deal of obfuscation. Continental philosophers aren't, most transparent writers and so on. But it's a thing that where the obscurities creep in when it comes to even self-descriptions of the analytic program sometimes.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it, and so that's extremely helpful, and this explains this notion of the myth of Frege as based on kind of both an analogy, but also a very kind of circumscribed or particular reading of Frege that's doing quite a lot of work that's not necessarily consistent with his own. And then you introduce modal logic and the return of metaphysics, and I felt that David Lewis must be introduced into this conversation given his stature in the history there. And perhaps it might be useful just for the benefit of people listening to describe and give a contour of this, of your 8th chapter there on this pivotal moment as well, which makes up, like, I guess, a very huge chunk of what philosophers do in analytic philosophy. I myself am only like superficially acquainted with it, so it would actually be helpful for me. Can you explain modal logic, David Lewis, and the return of metaphysics for us?
Yeah, so this is a part of the book where it gets, this is very much intentional, it gets very substantively philosophical. That's a very conscious decision, because I think a social history of philosophy isn't, a story about social stuff that then, it so happens that you're talking about philosophical ideas. But this is a place where I try to really get into sort of the shape of analytic philosophy itself and how it's been transformed over time and kind of what constitutes it. And to use maybe overused term, but ideologically, right? So what's the sort of ideological function? So modal logic is the study of those bits or areas of logic that have to do with necessity and possibility. So modal logicians are interested in how to understand statements of the form, I could have not spoken to Daniel today, or it's necessary that 2 + 2 = 4. Right? It's one thing to say that 2 + 2, as a matter of fact, equals 4, but it's something else to say that that's necessarily the case, could not have been otherwise. Now, modal logic had a tough time for much of the history of analytic philosophy, and the roots of that are really in the 19th century, but the 19th century trouble is, as I do in the book, right, can be sort of set up by going right back to the earlier phase of logic and the work of Leibniz. So Leibniz is really the initiator of what we've come to call formal logic, right? So the idea that you could very systematically and technically have a logic in which, instead of writing out full sentences with the words that we actually use in them, you abstract away from the words that we use, and you have what look like mathematical operators, right? standing for sort of standing in for terms. So you can say, A implies B, and you're talking about the form of those statements. Just you could plug in any A or plug in any B, and you'd be talking about all of those at once. And Leibniz was very interested in how to understand inference, which is what logic's basically about, in both what are called extensional contexts and intensional contexts. So just to explain those terms, extensional means the kind of uses of language in which all that matters is whether you, in using a certain word, get at the thing that you're talking about. So, I could talk about London, or I could talk about the capital of the United Kingdom, and the thing that matters is, am I just picking out the thing, right? And in extensional contexts, that's all that matters. But intensional contexts are quite different, because they are to do with what's actually meant by the terms. And now modal logic is one of the areas that get you into intensional logic. And this generates a whole series of complexities that the people that were trying to carry out Leibniz's project for a formal logic, they all founded on this. And it was sort of a mess. And then in the 19th century, there's a breakthrough in formal logic, which is due to a man called George Boole, and responsible for Boolean algebra and so on, Boolean operators. And Boole, importantly, is a mathematician. And because he's a mathematician, the kind of logic that he's interested in is purely extensional. That is, it's purely about inferences, understanding inferences in terms of whether or not the terms manage to pick out the thing referred to, right? That's all that matters. So to try and explain this a little bit more concretely, so if you take something like set theory, right, what matters in set theory is you take some element, does it belong to set A or not? Does it belong to set B? And is it true that if it belongs to set A, it also belongs to set B? And you can do all this without understanding anything about the meaning of the term that A is standing in for. It's just a question of which box does it go in, right? Yes or no. And because Boole was only interested in that, formal logic really took off, because it's much easier to do formal logic in a purely extensional way and not worry about the meanings of terms. So that went on for a long time. And then in the 70s, with some prehistory, sort of in earlier parts of the 20th century, but there's a sort of breakthrough in modal logic, which is due to the work of these two really kind of gargantuan figures in analytic philosophy, who are Saul Kripke and David Lewis. And Lewis, so Kripke and Lewis are kind of fundamentally opposed in a certain way in how they now deal with the statements of necessity and possibility. Where what they share is that they think that the way to understand the statement that something's necessarily the case is to say it's true in every possible world. Right? This is a way of sort of quite literally analyzing the statement. But then they have very different conceptions of what that amounts to. And what Lewis fundamentally does is he says, in response to people like Kripke, who are bringing modality or the modal back into logic, which seems to require talking about something really, really horrible, which is essences. And they're often referred to by analytic philosophers as Aristotelian essences. So it's like, oh, this is like a horrible throwback to Aristotelian modes of thought. Because, you know, talking about what's necessarily the case seems to imply having to talk about how things are essentially. And that's, you know, if we think back to when we're talking about natural science and Machism and how it sort of, you know, treats natural science as the paradigm of all inquiry, there's no place for essences in natural sciences. This is a kind of non-scientific or extra scientific concept. Incidentally, one of the things that Horkheimer points out about the logical positivists, they can't talk about essences. Okay, so Kripke is sort of bringing this stuff back in, and it looks threatening in a way. Richard Rorty said that the famous lectures that Kripke gave in which he set out ideas turned analytic philosophy on its ear. So it was like, and it was supposed to spell the end of, you know, this kind of central way of seeing things that analytic philosophy has. You know, the way in which it's allied to the natural sciences and the way it resists talking about essences as this kind of, you know, these things that you sort of can't get through to, that you'd have to sort of penetrate through experience to get to, and that can't be done. Lewis makes this extraordinary kind of master move, and I think, you know, Lewis is one of the most impressive, along with Kripke, is one of the most impressive of the philosophers in the analytic tradition. And what he says is basically, we can have all this stuff about possible worlds, and we can talk about statements about what's possibly the case and what's necessarily the case. So remember, necessarily the case means it's true in all the possible worlds. Usually thought of like all the scenarios that there could have been. And Lewis says, we can do all of that, but we can retain extensionalism. Right? So extensionalism is a word for the idea that you can do all of logic purely extensionally. So as if it's all like mathematics or all like set theory. It's just a question of what you put in what boxes. And you don't actually need these concepts like necessary and possible, really. You can analyze them away. And the way Lewis does that is to say, really, what it comes to talk about possible worlds isn't to talk about, you know, ways things might have been by contrast with how they actually are in the actual world, but to treat them as actually existing worlds. So there's this huge number of worlds, all of which exist, and in which statements are just straightforwardly true or false. So instead of saying, you know, it could have been that I, you know, failed to show up to this podcast recording and I, you know, stayed in bed instead. The way to analyze this is to say, there is another world in which Christoph stays in bed. Right? Over there, somewhere else, he does that. And so this has the kind of peculiar and almost perverse consequence that actually the term possible world is a real misnomer, because they are existent worlds. They're not things that could have been the case. They're things that are actually the case. So Lewis thought, well, all these worlds exist. And in these other worlds, these other things are happening. And they happen to, so the one where I'm in bed rather than talking to you, is actually not me, but it's my counterpart, which creates all kinds of metaphysical complexities itself. But the idea is basically, you know, you can have what modal logic seems to require, but do it as if it can be done just in terms of, you know, what's the case and what's not the case. So what Lewis is able to do is he feels he's able to do justice to a Humean conception of philosophy, actually, and he explicitly pays homage to Hume, and he calls this conception of what the world is that we as subjects are faced with the Humean mosaic. And the Humean mosaic he describes as something like just all the little things one after another, and all the little things just one after another kind of laid out for us in front of us as a subject, sort of inertly, just to be sort of taken in.
So that's extremely helpful. I'm so happy that you've taken the time to explain these things for us as a way to help listeners go research for themselves. But what you conclude is that it falls back into empiricism and doesn't stay true to metaphysics if we understand metaphysics as the capacity to arrive at something objective on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's like a confusion about its own methodology. So why is that the case? And the other feeling I had here was it's a bit of a paradox because these thinkers are the best of the analytic tradition apropos their originality and their inventiveness, but perhaps they are also the apex of your underlying thesis regarding the unthought apolitical sort of absence of social. So it's kind of a tragic story at the end. Perhaps, although, I mean, one of my mentors, Alain Badiou, has written this book, Logics of Worlds, and this there are sort of like little like lifelines or little like sort of conceptual ways that perhaps other philosophers might supplement the absence of method from within their own orientations.
Very curious what you said about, it's after all kind of empiricism.
I think that's what your claim is as far as I understand.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking it's curious about Lewis, and it's really important that there's a big difference between the people who are really good, who are the kind of these sort of brilliant. I was going to say brilliant guys. They're generally guys, right? In terms of just how it functions, that so Lewis is very much overtly turning metaphysics back into empiricism. You wouldn't put it in those terms, but he's sort of overtly doing that. So in Lewis, it's quite interesting how the ideology is operative in the sense that he's got the whole sort of liberal bourgeois empiricist 18th century basically conception, according to which there's the world sort of just given to us, and then all the autonomy and all the sort of activities on the side of the subject that just has to cope with all of this, right? Which lends itself to the conceptions of the legal person who can go into the court of law to defend herself or himself. All has to come from the legal subject, and he's very explicitly getting us to think of the world as sort of all these individual bits. It's very kind of atomistic, and then there's the subject stood over against this. And Kripke, interestingly, I think is he doesn't have that picture at all, actually. And you could think of Kripke taking in the direction of a certain kind of social philosophy, which isn't really spelled out, but you could think that. But Lewis is interesting to contrast with the people that have taken up Lewis's work, because they don't really care about this kind of scrupulous methodological thought that you get if you read the introductions to Lewis's books. He's very not just upfront about his orientation and his methodology, but he really cares about that. Whereas what people take up from Lewis is something quite different, which is basically kind of highly technical way of doing philosophy, sort of unmoored from actually these kinds of questions. And so they reproduce the ideology, but in this kind of much less interesting way. And what happens with metaphysics is that it's not that people hold on to the idea that, well, we can do something, quote unquote metaphysics, but it's empiricism really. They actually subscribe to the idea it's really metaphysics. It's really proper metaphysics. And they'll say things like, we're carving nature at its joints.
Right.
Famous phrase from Plato. And then you ask them, so how are you doing that? So what kind of knives are you using to carve nature at its joints? And they say, well, we consult our intuitions, which is really it's really quite shocking. If you think by contrast with the kind of methodological issues Collingwood was raising about analytic philosophers and sort of pinpointing some of the dogmatism where they end up a position, they have starting positions they can't defend. But to say well, we're using our intuitions to carve up the inner constitution of reality seems sort of deeply unphilosophical.
This drives us to the area of analytic philosophy that I think I'm most familiar with, which is sort of what analytic philosophers, how they intervene in ethics and politics. And the foundation of intuition is very curious because it's often sort of elided or sort of marginalized. You wouldn't, it's not typically sort of presented as if, so it's almost it's also a criticism, the fact that you're framing it this way as making it central perhaps. But first, before we get to that, I do think that we should talk about Rorty and the extent to which Rorty may or may not be, as what I'm calling, an outlier to the wider thesis here, insofar as Rorty prides himself as a social philosopher, right? And maybe for all of my, I mean, as a young person just getting into philosophy, I actually first read Richard Rorty in the same way that I read Chomsky, as like, this is as radical as it gets. This is as radical as it's allowed to be, right? Philosophy and Social Hope, his various commentaries on American history and so on. He wrote a great kind of text, right, in the 90s, I believe, on democracy. So, and he was perhaps as politically, morally engaged as one could be as an analytic philosopher, and we should critically commend him for that. But my feeling is that given your position here, just as we saw with Sellars, you're not really interested per se in sort of, I don't know, exaggerating his politics. So give me your Rorty take, as it were, and how he fits in this story.
Well, Rorty is very interesting, partly because he was a non-analytic philosopher who became an analytic philosopher.
Right, he started with like Husserl and Heidegger, right?
Well, he certainly, immersed himself in. Actually, I don't know when he became interested in Heidegger, because there's a
maybe that was later.
Yeah, I mean, the Heidegger figures very, very importantly in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which is his great sort of later work, right? But he certainly worked with people. So he had his education at Chicago and Yale when those two universities were still not analytic. So this is the Second World War, but it actually takes quite a long time for a lot of the departments to become taken over by analytic philosophers, because it requires, people being moved out and so on. So Cornell's one of the first, but then Harvard and then Yale and Chicago are quite late. And Rorty then gets a job which requires him, I can't remember now, perhaps at Princeton, but he gets a job somewhere where analytic philosophy is starting to be, the thing that the cool guys do, the people at the forefront. And I say that not to sort of deride it, because it was clear that this was some of the most exciting philosophy that was happening at the time, actually, in America. So he quickly, instructs himself. He reads everything and gets himself up to speed in order to survive in this department with his colleagues. And he becomes converted to analytic philosophy. So he edits this big collection called The Linguistic Turn in 1967. Easy year to remember because so many important things are published in that year, which has this introduction, which is this kind of manifesto. It's very evangelical. He says things like, there has never been such a, perhaps he doesn't say there's never been, but anyway, he said, this is one of the great revolutions in philosophy, and nothing will ever be the same after this linguistic turn. And then he sort of increasingly gets doubts, So Rorty's work's very interesting to me in particular because he's so acute about the internal disarray that analytic philosophy gets itself into already in the 50s. So almost as soon as it sort of becomes canonized as one single thing. That's partly because there are people doing it who are very, very acute. So Quine and Sellars are probably the two most significant figures who are responsible for this sort of beginnings of an internal collapse. And then later Rorty's also interesting, I think, because of his decision to sort of align himself with pragmatism and the pragmatist tradition, which he then sort of brings into line with early Heidegger and late Wittgenstein, who are these two major figures in this book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. So he establishes for himself, I guess, a unique position that's still very much in touch with analytic philosophy, but seeking to move beyond it. One thing I should mention, just as a sort of autobiographical thing, is that I remember as a beginning graduate student, so sort of 2010s, I went to a conference that was, it was some sort of anniversary of Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, and there were leading analytic philosophers there. And the mood was one of, I mean, a sort of hysterical, hysterical collective condemnation of what Rorty had done. It was considered to be completely beyond the pale. This book that he'd written, by which he had, he'd attacked basically the whole thing. And it was, he should be treated as, the Germans have this expression, Nestbeschmutzer, like the one that fouls his own nest. And
no kidding.
Yeah. So Rorty is one of those people that of whom there are very different perceptions based on, which part of the academy you look at. And that is something that's changed, I think, in analytic philosophy since then. I don't think people care quite as much about those things anymore.
Yeah.
They maybe still see it a bit that way, but there was a sense of, this guy's got to be taken down.
That's remarkable. So I want to introduce this very important, I guess, mostly appears as in ethics. You talk a lot about the foundation of what most undergraduates are exposed to as, various forms of thought experiments, which at first blush appear with the veneer of a kind of scientific rigor. But you question that as foundationalized on intuitions. So first, you already kind of hinted at that, but tell us about intuitions and how it feeds into a type of new utilitarian theory of ethics, which of course we're extremely familiar with, Peter Singer. Every ethics class has half the time, I feel, on thought experiments and Singer and then, Rawls and so on. And, Rawls, of course, John Rawls is a part of this story too. He's a big figure, a big fish here. So is Singer. But how, because you start the chapter by kind of linking it back to the origin. And it's an interesting point because you see another entanglement of a kind of contradiction going on here that kind of maybe is related to this unthought, dehistoricized conception of human agency in the subject that's at work here. That of course, as a Hegelian, it's an immediate problem, perhaps. But tell us first about intuition and how it fits into this situation of how analytic philosophers are thinking in the field of ethics.
Yeah. By the way, the talk of intuitions, like the explicit invocation of intuitions, are actually quite widespread, right? So it doesn't take that much reading around the ethics literature. Also, these other areas that we were talking about. But the notion that intuitions are what really matter ultimately is surprisingly widespread. I mean, surprisingly in light of sort of appreciation of what the limitations are of relying on intuitions. And one of the things, of course, is the, as you were saying, the ahistoricist picture, which gives you, very, very naive picture of human subjectivity, according to which, we're just these sort of don't know what one would say really, but sort of unsituated subjects. Let's see what our intuitions are. As soon as you start to think that our intuitions themselves might be, at the very least, influenced by who we're constituted to be, by the communities that we live in, and so on, you'd start to think, well, it'd be very interesting to ask people what their intuitions are, but not because it's like the basis of ethical arguments. Where by ethical arguments I mean like attempts to determine what people should do,
right?
But something quite different from that would be revealing of something quite different. It's the type of ethics by intuition pumping.
Well, you can also see how a type of deontological Kantian ethics would find a bridge here, given that Kantian ethics itself is allergic to situational concerns. So you see it kind of complements one another in some sense. But
yeah, anyway. I mean, the Kantians wear it on their sleeve, right? We'll appeal to intuition and then they have a whole theory about the constitution of the will as what the will determines is the expression of reason itself. So we better go with that because and so the Kantians have in a sense respectable philosophical theory, which you may agree with or disagree with, but they have a story to tell. But how it can be that our intuitions can tell us these.
Right.
But these other people, so there's kind of utilitarian tradition in ethics. They don't have that. So what they'll do is they'll take the classic trolley problem, which is the driver of a runaway train. You lose control of the navigation of the train, except insofar as you can steer it, and you see that there's people tied down to the track in front of you. There's 5 of them, and you're heading towards them, and there's a sidetrack to the right that you could turn onto, and there's only one there. Are you justified in turning the train so killing one, save the 5? And then endless iterations of this, and you might not be the driver, you might be the bystander, and all sorts of things. And the idea is that it's somehow specially important what people intuitively say in the different cases, and then from that we can extrapolate certain ethical principles, right? So the intuitions become these sort of important data. Well, I'll say, so Daniel, what intuitively, what would you say in this case? And then I'll present you with another case, and then the differences between the answers that you give in different cases are going to be my sort of data for constructing a theory about what's ethically salient.
I really like the point that you say is that thought experiments as a concept, who introduced it? Mach.
Ernst Mach, yes.
Amazing. He returns.
Yes.
It's just a funny side point that it happens to be the one. Okay, so I see your point. And then you go on to say that intuitions does a lot of work. They then reread the history of like Plato's dialogues with this intuition-centric conception of what's actually going on. Yeah. For example, it's kind of inescapable, I guess you could say, in analytic philosophy. So how does that strike you? Like sort of, can you say more about what you see as the inadequacy of intuitions and why it seems that what's the sort of ideological dimension to perhaps the privilege? We know some of the ideological effects, which is sort of evident in the way that some of these philosophers relate to concrete political happenings, events, etc., which we could talk about. But let's remain at the level of theory. Could you say a bit more about this? I find it so fascinating.
Yeah, so many things to say about the ideology. I mean, one thing to say, I suppose, is that judge by the effects, because the effects show you quite a lot about what's going on. So if you take a seminar room full of people and they're all fairly similar, fairly similar group of people, and they're
Sure.
all asking each other their intuitions, and then
Right.
on the basis of that, they're agreeing about some ethical view. You sort of wonder what it is that prevents them from ever questioning. What if we asked other sorts of people? So in that sense, there's something quite obvious to say, but I think there's if you sort of drill down a bit more into how the use of the thought experiments work and think about the form of them as well, what sort of thought experiments they are, they tend to be, you might say, kind of calculative in form. So it's, do you kill one to save the five? Do you? So it's about a certain kind of notion of weighing up situations in which the idea is that the form of the situation, kind of the structure of it, is what really counts. And that, I think, is ideologically interesting in the sense, I think, more that you're asking about, which is like what's actually going on, more intellectually. And there, so this is something that I came across as I was researching the book, but I was very taken by discussion by a philosopher called Cora Diamond, who is an analytic philosopher who's very strongly inspired by Wittgenstein. And I think a bit for that reason, she's someone who's a bit pushing at the edges of what's a sort of centrally analytic philosophy. And she made this point, which to me seemed, really, really decisive, which was it's based actually on work in psychology, where, so if you ask children of a certain age their responses to ethical thought experiments, and this program sort of got going, there was a notion that you could track children's ethical development, a bit like, the Jean Piaget conception of just tracking their intellectual development in general, but it was like the ethical development. And the idea was that when they got to a certain age, I don't know, 8 or something, and you would say, is somebody permitted to do this one horrible thing to this person in order that this other person gets some greater benefit or something like that. The theory says, well, at a certain age, let's say 8, they should get that it's a question of weighing up these two things. And they shouldn't be saying things like, but what if, we could change the parameters a bit? And what if the two, so in one of these cases, what if the two people talk to each other and they try to work it out? And so the dilemma could be transformed. That's something that they're supposed to, that you'd expect younger children to say, but at a certain point they get it, right? They get it's a kind of calculative thing. And the key insight that Cora Diamond has, which is in a sense completely obvious to anyone who's ever had to engage in life in an ethical manner, which I would hope is all humans, is that actually ethics isn't like that at all. Not only is it not like that at all, but it's kind of the opposite. What ethics demands of us is to make these individual judgments in individual cases, where actually, relying on the form of the problem hardly ever gets you anywhere, right? It's true that it's, all things being equal, it would be better to harm only one person rather than two. I mean, but that's so obvious that never really kind of enters into our ethical deliberation. It's actually the exercise of the imagination in an ethical situation, which is the thing that really counts. And so there's a feminist theorist who comes from psychology called Carol Gilligan, who sort of worked up this idea in the case of gender differences between children. Because interestingly, it's I forget if it's 8, but something like that. When you do the experiments, girls tend to give different responses from boys if you generalize, and the boys score much better because they do the calculative thing. They're much more apt to do that. Who are being told that they're silly and they got it wrong are perhaps actually onto something. Or Diamond kind of picking up on Gilligan's work on that.
Okay, so this has been amazing. effective altruism is gotten a lot of media attention in recent years. Can you discuss how it fits into this sort of analytic ethics world? At first blush, I imagine that a lot of analytic philosophers in the academy probably would want to distance themselves from it. But first, what is it? And it's sort of a quite pernicious phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? Well, utilitarianism by another name, a particular version perhaps of utilitarianism. As to whether people distance themselves from it, I think many people do in ethics distance themselves from it, but there are also quite a few effective altruists in philosophy departments. So among the analytic philosophers, it's not just that there are these sort of institutes in which this is pursued, but it's quite a sort of lively component, I would say, of the picture. And well, one way to sort of situate effective altruism is really by contrast with the thing we were just talking about, which is the reliance on intuitions. Because, sort of take one step back, we were talking earlier about positivism and its sort of conception of philosophy having sort of no other role than to be, in some sense, the handmaiden to the natural sciences, which is not to really degrade it, but right, it's in the business of somehow connecting itself with the natural sciences. This leaves very little room for ethics. So there was a whole period when ethics was sort of sidelined and people were only interested in what they called meta-ethics, which is the discussion of what moral discourse is like, or what people are arguing about when they make moral arguments. But there wasn't any attempt to say how people should actually live. So first order ethics, so-called. The first order ethics came back, and it was there were sort of various different versions, quite a bit of Kantianism. And then there was a sort of intuition stuff that we've been talking about. And then there's this revival of utilitarianism, for which one of the key figures is really Peter Singer. And so his work is really sort of foundational in this. And he's very much, the godfather, I suppose, of effective altruism. The idea of effective altruism is, well, let's just calculate the best outcomes. And let's not rely on our intuition, sort of leave your intuitions at the door, because our intuitions are often connected with these parts of us that if we were more rational, we would overcome. So one of the things I do in the book is, I rely on journalism by people who've actually looked at effective altruism organizations and how they work and how they treat their members. Because
that's why I said people might want to distance themselves from it.
Yeah,
I was referring to that. Yeah. How this actually exists in the world becomes alarming, I guess.
Yeah. So, I didn't have to say anything sort of in my own voice about this. I'm just relying on journalistic work, which has really shown some of what goes on in these effective altruism communities. So one of the kinds of things that happen is that people, when they've entered, are very much encouraged to sort of leave a lot of their baggage at the door. In that sense, it's a little bit like entering a cult, one might think, and subject themselves to this sort of hypertrophied idea of being completely rational about everything. And of course, the completely rational thing is, the way effective altruism basically works is, well, you've got to make as much money as you possibly can. And then you take that money and then you send it to the place where it will be most effective. And then there are people that have to decide how all of this works, right? So there are people that have to get together and they have to go into these sort of retreats, and they, rationally calculate what the best places are to send the money. And what happens in these places is that, for example, they tend to, they're very male dominated, and then they tend to encourage polygamy. And then people who say that they don't want to participate in that, women generally, are then told that they are a regressive factor in, you know, the advancement of the cause of utility, effectively, in the world. So, I mean, this is really, really horrifying, right? This mobilization of rationality, in quotation marks, as a kind of instrument of.
So they've sort of kissed intuition goodbye, as it were. And,
yeah,
it's all out the window now. Yeah, that's quite tyrannous. Wow, that's an interesting symptom of there's obviously so much to be said. I want to now ask you a final question. I love this book, by the way. I hope that's obvious. And, you know, we'll have to have you back to talk about Marxism. I could talk to you about analytic Marxism for quite a while, but that's maybe for another time. Let's put it this way. And analytic philosophy is changing. Some sense maybe that American pragmatist adaptation to social dynamics is a part of that equation. But it's absorbing feminism. It's like a late comer, right? You know, you can see that, like, you know, eventually they will maybe have like an analytic Derrida. That would be the true end of analytic philosophy.
Yeah, I guess that would be the litmus test, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Then it's over. It's just it's all done, right? Yet throughout all of this story, it seems to be that there is a liberalism that is the sort of disavowed political core. So while analytic philosophers may parasitize Heidegger or continental figures that are supposed to be off limits to them, or feminism, or race, or class, I doubt they would do class, but, you know, what or XXX. Maybe my question to you, if I could summarize it or make it more succinct, would be sort of what is repeated in this, what you call colonizing, that then marks the limitation of that takeover of it. Does that make sense? Like, where can analytic philosophy go? Because probably you're going to make a lot of these people quite upset. Maybe some of them will be reflective from your critique. But like all critiques, you're going to divide, and that's fine. So I guess my question is general, and tell us about the sort of meaning of colonizing, these progressive changes, their limitations, their relationship to liberalism. So yeah, so sort of bring it all home for us, if you would.
Yeah, I think, by the way, on the question of, you know, how people are going to respond and are responding, I think there's quite a big generational dimension to this. So, and as you said, analytic philosophy is changing, and I think a lot of the change is coming from younger people in the discipline. So I think there's a certain kind of audience that is relatively amenable to the message of this book, who are people that are already a bit loosened up for the idea of doing something about where academic philosophy is in the, you know, in the Anglosphere and certain other parts of the world where this is very, very dominant. Whereas then there are other people who I think you know, manifest a much more defensive reaction. And a sort of case study in what kind of reaction one might get is Ernest Gellner's book from ages ago in the 60s, attacking, or late 50s, attacking Oxford philosophy. And what happened was the academic establishment in Oxford just closed ranks against him, including people who are actually friends with him, which is very interesting. But sorry, yeah, to return to your main question about colonization, what are the limits? So I think, something I do right at the beginning of the book is to link analytic philosophy to 18th century modes of thought or patterns of thought, and I think that's probably quite relevant here because I think there's a sort of inherent limitation to the paradigm that has to do with the idea that, well, the world is sort of given to us as, how I was describing with David Lewis, sort of, one thing after another, one thing sort of arranged, this sort of whole arrangement of little things together. And then we are the autonomous subject that's to make sense of all of this. I think if you have that, and then the subjects of themselves thought of as in a highly individualistic way. Groups of people are just sort of composites of individuals, and there's very little scope for thinking about social, the social relationality. The theme of the other, for example, doesn't really appear anywhere in analytic philosophy, and I think that's non-accidental. I think that's sort of part of the identity. So in that sense, I'm quite pessimistic about the thing that some people within analytic philosophy I think are very optimistic about. So people talk now about the social turn in analytic philosophy, and I think actually it's very interesting if you think a little bit about what the epistemological turn and the linguistic turn were supposed to be.
Yeah,
they were at least supposed to be a kind of radical sort of reconfiguration of philosophy itself, whereby completely different things showed up as important. And I don't think that the so-called social turn that people have correctly identified in analytic philosophy is like that. I think it's more analytic philosophy has turned its attention to social issues, and now something really interesting is happening, which is it's performing and demonstrating its inability really to grapple with those issues on their on their full scale, or to really do them justice. And you get these versions of feminism and of critical race theory, which are the two things I focus on in the on colonizing philosophy, where you get again a certain kind of slightly bizarre abstraction sets in, I suppose, is a way to try and summarize it. With feminism, analytic feminists became very, very interested in the idea that pornography could be understood in terms of analysis of speech acts. So speech acts, a theory of J.L. Austin in the 50s. And there were very specific reasons for that, which was that actually self-described radical Marxist feminist Catherine McKenna was talking in those sorts of terms about pornography and about the idea of feminism in relation to pornography, partly because, as you all know better than me, US law in that area is all defined in terms of rights to free speech. That's a very particular thing. But the analytic philosophers sort of picked up on this and started to do this kind of quite abstracted Austinian sort of philosophy of language treatment of pornography, with some quite interesting results. But it's very difficult to think to sort of see how it advanced a social movement called feminism. Right. And similarly with critical race theory, critical philosophy of race as practiced sort of within the analytic camp. And there it's a bit more complex because it sort of straddles, it goes outside of the analytic realm as well. But you get sort of emphasis on very abstract questions like, what is a race? Which are not, they're not unimportant questions, but they're treated in a way as if they were a bit like just other things that one might talk about in the philosophy seminar room, like what's this, what's a square, what's a cube, what's a definitional issues start to become, dominant in a way that completely obscures that, critical race theory came out of, all these different things like this legal storytelling tradition that's really about aspects of people's lives and experience and the nature of politics that they just kind of completely disappear from the. Well, I say completely. They to an overwhelming degree sort of disappear from the picture. I think that's quite striking.
I have an encore question, and then I will let you go. Rorty was interesting, of course, because he's so he's a fusional figure. Well, with the exception of Marx, he doesn't. Somehow Marx kind of disappears from Rorty. That's another problem. But yeah, my question is, perhaps if analytic philosophy is at the end of the day sort of revealed to have this sort of locus or seat within as an expression of academic power, and then it ultimately has a kind of incoherent unifying basis, it's kind of non-existent, perhaps then various figures of analytic philosophy, or what we called it, could be equipped and incorporated into other philosophical projects. And my question was sort of, are there existing philosophers that are kind of bridge builders, or is the system set up in such a way that that tends to prohibit such bridge building, whereby you have like a Ray Brassier who says, well, Wilfrid Sellars helps me figure out something missing in French philosophy, for example, or in Hegel, right? Or, you know what I'm saying? Like, is that a type of method that we might see more of? Are you already seeing philosophers do that? Does that interest you? Or do you think that the system kind of prohibits such bridge building? Because what I've seen is really, it's not common. The system does prohibit it. And if it does happen, it's kind of rare, and it happens sort of like late career, maybe accidentally, but it's not situated in like departments. There's this kind of disciplinary thing. So maybe that's the basis of the disciplinary. But does that make sense? And can you think of any people that are doing that interest you?
Yeah, well, I mean, late career suggests, there are things holding people back earlier in their careers from doing such things, right? And I mean, one thing to mention that's obvious, I suppose, is that hyper specialization, which means it's just very difficult to take on. Well, it's very difficult for analytic philosophers, or people trained in that tradition, and then they have to operate, under the demands of submitting their articles to the respected journals and so on. It's very difficult, actually, even just to take on big topics.
And how do you know so much about analytic philosophy? I didn't even ask you that. Where did that come about for you? Because did you do your dissertation? What did you do your dissertation on?
I wrote my dissertation on Nietzsche.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, yeah. Wow. Hey, well, that's amazing. Now we have many things to talk about. So where did you get your fascination with analytic philosophy? Maybe I'll cut this and put it at the beginning.
Yeah. So, well, part of that is just a kind of question of, efficient causation. What was I subjected to? And so my education was, as an undergraduate at Cambridge, I did philosophy as a subject on its own. And it was, heavily analytic, I would say. Probably the Cambridge department was then more sort of purely committed to analytic philosophy even than it is now. So I was sort of surrounded by it, and I was trying to make sense of it. And I'd gone to Cambridge thinking, well, I'll apply there because it has this great tradition. Russell and Wittgenstein were there. And I came into it thinking my interest was always in the history of philosophy, because I'd read, as an adolescent, I'd read these things like, I read Peter Gay's big 2-volume work on the Enlightenment. And that to me was history. That was why philosophy was interesting. So I thought, well, get in touch with this tradition. And one of the first things you were told at Cambridge was never mention Wittgenstein, because that's just, you're going to contract this disease called Wittgensteinitis and you'll never recover, and so on. That was very disappointing. But I thought, having been sort of in the midst of it, and then doing my PhD in a department where most people were doing analytic philosophy, even though I was doing mostly history philosophy, and I was also working with Spinoza and on Kant with.
When did Hegel become a figure for you?
Hegel a bit later, and I think grew out of interest in Kant, and also probably then coming into contact with the work of John McDowell, actually.
Oh, really?
So there's the McDowell-Sellars route and so on, which is a bit responsible for getting more and more interested in Hegel. Although I'd read Hegel as an undergraduate because we were allowed to read part of the Phenomenology of Spirit, and I thought that this was just the most mind-blowingly extraordinary sort of philosophical journey to be put on, and I was fascinated by that.
I know I've been meaning to read, speaking of analytic Hegelians, I guess, in Brandam's Spirit of Trust. I haven't yet read it. I'm eager to. Well, listen, this has been very enjoyable. I'm very excited to bring you back on and talk about your book on Marx. And so just want to thank you for taking the time and encourage everybody to pick up the book, available at Verso Books and other locations. You should do an Audible version of it,
Yeah. That'd be fun. Yeah.
It could work. Maybe, although some chapters not so much. But anyways, we'll close it there, comrades. Thank you so much, Christoph.
Thanks so much, Daniel.